Welcome to Dieu Han Review, where stories don't just end, they echo. We hope you're safe wherever this finds you. Comment below where you're watching from and what time it is. Today, everything shifts in a breath. When guilt crosses paths with quiet love, what will remain? Some moments don't need music or lines. Just silence, a glance, and the air stills. Because the deepest scenes aren't performed, they unfold quietly when no one's watching and everything starts to tremble. Lam stepped out slowly, each breath heavy, each step weighed down by memory. His conversation with Fan had left him raw, exposed. He reached the gate as Dieu Han arrived, arms full, her child trailing close. They both stopped. She didn't know this man, but something in his posture, too still, too careful, set her heart on edge. Lam's eyes flickered with something unspoken. She felt a shift in the air, unaware she stood at the edge of someone else's unfinished story. Something felt off. Dieu Han couldn't name it, but she knew it. It wasn't fear, just an invisible thread of tension hanging between two strangers who might not be strangers at all. Lam opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no right to speak. Not yet. Dieu Han turned away, holding her child's hand tighter than before. Lam stood still, watching them fade from view, wondering how many lives he had disrupted simply by running when it mattered most. From the doorstep, Dieu Han glanced back. His eyes haunted her, tired, searching, almost apologetic. She shook the feeling off and entered her home, unaware she had just crossed paths with a man whose past was tied to Than's deepest wounds. She didn't know his name nor his story. But something about that moment lingered. Later, she'd wonder why her heart had quickened. Why one stranger's silence felt heavier than words. Some histories knock long before they ever speak. Behind the door, Dieu Han stood still, heart racing. She told herself it was nothing, a passing moment, a stranger's stare. But the weight of it lingered. There was a storm in that man's eyes, and lately, Than had been pulling away too. Could those fragments be connected? Outside, Lam walked off, carrying more than just silence. He left behind tension, unfinished stories, and the distant scent of trouble. Something had been exchanged, unspoken, undeniable, not thunder yet. But the air knew it was coming. Do you believe people cross our path by accident or by design? Tell us what you think below. And if Dieu Han's story has stirred something in you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Dieu Han RV, and tap the bell so you'll never miss a moment. Because sometimes, the quietest meetings echo the loudest truths. And a single glance, a pause, a breath can rewrite the story you thought you knew. Dieu Han lingered at the doorway, the quiet pulling her in like a memory. Van sat beside Tom, his hand rising and falling on the boy's back with a tenderness that needed no words. The room breathed warmth, soft broth, simmering, the hush of sleep, the hush of care. For a heartbeat, she saw something fragile but real. Not a dream, not yet a promise. Just the gentle outline of a family she no longer believed she deserved, yet couldn't stop wanting. She stayed back, letting the silence speak. Than hadn't noticed her, eyes soft, movement steady, each touch like a lullaby only he could sing. Something in her chest tightened. This wasn't just help. This was love dressed in simplicity. She spent years guarding herself from hurt, from hope. But now, watching him with Tom, she realized what scared her most wasn't the risk. It was how easily she could imagine staying, and how much that frightened her heart. She walked toward him slowly, each step caught between curiosity and hesitation. The man from earlier, who was he? Her tone was calm, but then caught the quiver beneath it. He paused for a moment, then offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just someone asking for directions, he replied, voice light. First time I saw him. He turned back to the pot, but the tension stayed, fake in the air, like steam that wouldn't rise away. Dieu Han gave a small nod, but her mind wandered far from the moment. His words had landed too cleanly, like something practiced rather than felt. She didn't press him, not because she trusted, but because she feared the truth would fracture the fragile peace they had. Still, Something inside her curled tight, unsettled. Not anger, not suspicion. Just that quiet ache of knowing something had shifted, and neither of them was ready to say it aloud. Not yet. Maybe never. Than passed her the bowl, careful not to let their fingers touch. The glance he gave was brief, like someone dodging a mirror. She accepted the soup with a quiet thank you, but the weight of things unsaid hovered between them. Steam rose, swirling through the kitchen, but it couldn't mask the cold underneath. They were sitting side by side, yet worlds apart. It wasn't the heat of the broth that filled her chest now, it was the ache of questions too delicate to ask. Her eyes drifted to Tom, fast asleep, innocence wrapped in each breath. Then to Than, who still wouldn't quite meet her gaze. A thought pressed against her chest. How long could they keep pretending this wasn't becoming something more? It terrified her, this quiet shift. Because love, once broken, doesn't return without questions. Not when hearts have been bruised. Not when ghosts still linger. And certainly not when a stranger's eyes still haunted her doorway like unfinished business. The silence coiled tighter, suffocating. Dieu Han stood abruptly, as if movement could disperse what emotion couldn't. "I'll finish the soup," she said, not looking at him. "Can you stay with Tom?" Her voice was clear, controlled, but her hands betrayed her, just barely trembling. Than nodded quickly, grateful for something tangible. Something to do. He needed a reason to breathe, to focus on anything but the ache that had bloomed in both of them and wasn't going away. As Than climbed the stairs, he glanced over his shoulder. Dieu Han stood by the stove, her back turned, gathering her hair into a knot with steady hands. But her shoulders told another story, rigid, strained, as if bracing against something she couldn't name. He wished, just for a second, that he could ease her burden. But some weights are stitched too tightly to the soul. Even when two people share a space, the battles inside them remain painfully solitary. She stirred the soup slowly, lost in thought. The air was thick with more than steam, it carried memories she hadn't invited. Did she believe in Than? Yes, but trust didn't silence the echo of that stranger's eyes. Something about him felt unfinished, unnamed. The past has strange timing, always knocking when we've just found a bit of calm. And sometimes, it wears a new face, asking no questions, only watching, quietly shifting the ground beneath our feet. Upstairs, Than sat beside Tom, but his thoughts were 1,000 miles away. Every breath he took felt heavier under the weight of unspoken truths. Lamb's return wasn't something he could unpack, not now, not without unraveling everything. He wanted to protect this fragile calm, even if it meant hiding behind silence. So he stayed quiet, stroking Tom's hair like it might ground him, but silence once again became a wall. And behind it, Than felt himself drifting further from what he couldn't yet face. With the soup finished, Dieu Han wiped her hands and climbed the stairs quietly. The air was hushed, almost sacred. When she reached the room, she paused at the door. There they were, Than asleep, arm gently wrapped around Tom, their breathing in sync like a lullaby. It wasn't a grand gesture, just quiet protection. But something inside her cracked. Maybe it was longing. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was the recognition of something she had once lost and didn't know if she could bear to find again. She didn't mean to linger, but something in that moment held her. Watching Than and Tom breathing in quiet harmony, she saw a life that almost was. A version of the future not built on running or regret. If hearts weren't so scarred, would this peace feel more real? Slowly, she pulled herself away, gently closing the door. Her hands moved on autopilot as she went to set the table, but her heart stayed upstairs, caught in the picture she hadn't dared to dream. Than stirred slowly from sleep, the edges of his dream still clinging to him. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then the soft rhythm of Tom's breathing grounded him. He rose carefully, not wanting to wake the boy, and made his way downstairs. The scent of warm food met him like an old comfort. At the table, Dieu Han looked up with quiet eyes and a gentle smile. She didn't speak, just nodded. Somehow, that gesture said everything he needed. They sat in a hush that wasn't awkward, just tender. Each bite they took seemed to soften something unspoken between them. The room felt warmer now, not just from the food but from the quiet understanding growing there. Then Dieu Han tilted her head slightly, her voice breaking the silence. "Do you always hum when you cook?" Van looked up, surprised, then laughed under his breath. "I guess I do. It keeps me from thinking too much. Keeps the heart from getting too loud." They kept eating, every bite quiet but meaningful. Dieu Han pointed at the stew, her tone teasing. "This is really good. You hiding a chef license from me?" Dan laughed. "Please, you think I'd feed Tom anything less than decent? He deserves better than I ever had." Her laugh came out pure, a sound without armor. It startled her how easily joy found its way in. Like a breeze slipping through a crack she didn't realize was open. Van set down his bowl, leaning back with a breath that felt older than he was. "You know, I never pictured this life. Me quiet, cooking, still, but maybe this stillness saved me." His voice was low, almost to himself. Across the table, Dieu Han looked at him, eyes soft. "Quiet isn't always empty," she whispered. "Sometimes it's where broken hearts finally stop bleeding." And in the hush between them, something shifted, small but sure, like trust taking its first breath. They sat together in silence, but this time it wrapped around them like a gentle blanket, not awkward, not forced, just quiet acceptance. Two people who had lost too much, learning how to sit with what remained. The stillness didn't demand explanations or promises, it simply let them be. And maybe that was the rarest gift of all, peace that didn't ask for anything, yet gave them everything they didn't know they needed. Sometimes, presence alone becomes the beginning of forgiveness. They sat without speaking, no declarations, no conclusions. Yet something soft passed between them, a thread woven not of words, but of quiet understanding. The kind that doesn't need to be defined to be real, the kind that stays. In that fragile moment, they weren't rebuilding the past. They were acknowledging the present. And maybe that was the first step towards something neither dared to name, but both secretly hoped for. Then, a soft cry broke the calm. Tom was awake. Dieu Han's body tensed instinctively, and she rushed upstairs. Van followed, quick and silent. It felt like the sacred hush between them had cracked. In the room, Tom reached out for her with sleep still clinging to his lashes. The child's small voice grounded them both, reminding them that no matter how tender or torn the moment, life kept moving forward without asking permission. Later, the three sat again at the table, Tom between them, a soft buzz of laughter and spoons tapping bowls. Dan wiped rice from the boy's cheek, his hand careful and practiced. Dieu Han watched, heart aching. The scene was simple, almost perfect. Like something borrowed from someone else's life. She smiled, but part of her wondered, was this real, or just borrowed time? A moment painted in warmth, shadowed by the fear it might not last. Dieu Han smiled and spoke with ease, even let herself laugh a little. But inside, her heart fluttered like a leaf caught in wind. Every shared glance between Fan and Tom chipped away at her guard. Was she part of their story, or just passing through like so many before? The doubt lingered, hope whispered, fear pushed back. What she wanted felt too big to ask for, yet too strong to deny. And in that quiet conflict, she realized she was already falling. As Tom clapped in delight, Dieu Han quietly excused herself. The dishes were an excuse. What she really needed was air, a moment to breathe. At the sink, she saw her reflection and barely knew the woman staring back. Love, once foreign, now clung to her ribs like a second skin. And fear whispered that none of this belonged to her. That any second now, it could vanish, leaving her with nothing but the echo of almost. Miles away, in a house swallowed by trees, Mr. Chen stood motionless beside the window. The forest pressed in like a secret he refused to share. Inside, the house told a different story, every knife sharpened, every map marked. He had prepared for this silence, for vanishing. Every shadow held memory, every drawer a plan. He didn't run blindly. He vanished deliberately, like a ghost who never wanted to be found, unless he chose to return. Mr. Chen sat hunched at the far end of a splintered table, fingers tapping a steady beat. His eyes didn't blink often. They stared into something no one else could see, calculations layered with anger, debt, and unfinished vengeance. Around him, the room pulsed with tension. Every object had purpose. Every silence, wait. He wasn't waiting, he was planning. And the quiet breath he drew now was merely the calm before the firestorm he was ready to ignite. He retrieved a small black phone from a hidden crevice in the wall. It wasn't ordinary. No SIM registry. No GPS. Burnt history. Hidden networks. He stared at the blank screen, unmoving, as if weighing more than just a call. Then he dialed slowly, precisely. The number wasn't saved. It lived only in memory. No names. No traces. This was not the kind of call one makes twice. This was the kind that either solved everything or destroyed it. A voice answered, low, rough, dangerous. Male. The kind of voice sharpened by secrets. Mr. Chen didn't waste time. He gave a time, a place, and one coded phrase. Then silence. Heavy, deliberate. Seconds passed. The reply came, clipped, cold, and final. No questions asked. No names spoken. Mr. Chen ended the call without hesitation. One move had been placed on the board. Not reckless, not desperate, but precise. And in games like this, precision was the only way to stay alive. He slid the phone back into the wall's hidden crevice and sealed it shut. The movements were careful, practiced. No fingerprints, no trace. He dusted off his hands, then opened a warm metal briefcase nearby. Inside were old photos, ink-smeared maps, and scattered notes written in hasty erratic strokes. One photograph lay face down. He flipped it over. A name was written on the back. Dieu Han. The ink had faded, but the implication remained fresh like a mark the past never finished carving. Mr. Chen ran a finger slowly across the letters of her name. His eyes didn't soften. No guilt, only calculation. He unfolded the map, tracing roads that led to the village. Dots connected. Arrows drawn. Every corner, every shortcut still burned into memory. Years hadn't erased his knowledge. They'd sharpened it. He studied the layout again, then leaned back, quiet but resolute. The past wasn't behind him. It was pulling him back. And now, for the first time in years, he was prepared to answer. Miles away, laughter echoed from a modest kitchen. Dieu Han smiled as Tom spilled rice on the floor, her hands busy, her heart unguarded. She didn't know that fate had stirred again. That somewhere, footsteps were being measured. That the past she thought buried had grown legs and teeth. Outside her window, the sun still shone. But a shadow was crossing mountains, drawn to her light. And in its silence, it carried memory sharp enough to bleed through any piece. What price will Dieu Han pay for the truth she doesn't yet know? Who is the shadow behind Mr. Chen's quiet move? And can peace survive when the past comes armed? Don't miss the next chapter in this unfolding storm. Like this video, subscribe to Dieu Han RV, and turn on the bell icon. Because sometimes the scariest monsters are the ones we once called family.